Forget what you've seen in period dramas. Forget the soft piano music and clean linen. In the real Victorian workhouse, there was no kindness, no charity. This wasn't a shelter, it was a last resort, designed not to lift you up, but to wear you down. So before we step inside, understand this. Entering the workhouse wasn't a beginning, it was the end. You go to the workhouse, it stands at the edge of town, behind high brick walls and iron gates. You've passed it before, always with a silent warning in your gut. Everyone knows what happens inside. And yet now, you have no choice. You step through the gate and into the shadow of the building. The first thing you notice is the silence. Not the comforting kind, but the controlled kind. Heavy, tense. You're led inside by a porter who barely looks at you. You're not spoken to kindly or gently. There's no sympathy, just process. The man asks your name, your age, your trade. He writes it down in a ledger without glancing up. Then you're stripped. Everything you wore when you entered is taken. Your clothes, your laces, even your comb. You're no longer a person. You're an inmate now. Next, a cold bath. Not to refresh you, to cleanse you, disinfect you. The water bites. You scrub yourself with harsh soap under the gaze of an attendant. No privacy, no dignity. Lice are shaved from your hair. Wounds are checked. Rossi's noted. You're inspected like livestock. Then, the uniform. Wool, coarse and stiff. Brown or gray. Identical to everyone else's. It doesn't matter what class you once were. Here, you are the same as the drunk, the orphan, the criminal. The workhouse doesn't care who you used to be, only that you're poor. And now, you're in its care. Men are sent one way, women another. Children are taken from both. Families are not housed together. Even married couples are split. You might hear your daughter crying down the corridor, but you're not allowed to comfort her. You will not eat with her. You will not sleep in the same wing. Weeks may pass before you even glimpse her again, if at all. Your first meal is a shock, not because it's bad, because it's exactly what you've heard. Gray, tasteless, and portioned with precision. A ladle of gruel, a heel of bread, teeth but barely. You eat in silence, no talking aloud. Eyes down, hands on laps. If you finish too fast, you wait. If you eat too slow, the plate is taken. Sleeping arrangements are strict. Long rooms, rows of iron beds, thin mattresses stuffed with straw. No personal items, no photographs, no candle by your bed. Lights out at the bell, and woe to anyone who speaks after. The matron patrols the halls like a warden. The next day, work begins. There is no adjustment period. You are expected to labor from dawn to dusk. No wage, no skill training, just punishment through repetition. Break stones, pick oakum, wash endless sheets, scrub the same floor 3 times a day. Your muscles will ache, but you will not be excused. Illness may earn you a place in the infirmary, but only if you collapse. You hear stories of those who tried to escape, of those who were caught and brought back, of those who went mad from the silence, the routine, the isolation. Sometimes a name is whispered. Sometimes a name disappears from the meal register. No one asks where they went. Each hour is rung in by a bell. Wake, work, eat, work, sleep, repeat. You begin to count time by the meals you are allowed. You memorize the cracks in the floor beneath your feet. You speak only when addressed. You smile never. Sometimes, the master of the workhouse visits the ward. He's well-dressed, clean boots, smells of pipe smoke and ink. He asks questions, not to hear you answer, but to test your obedience. You reply, yes sir, or no sir, and he moves on. Your life is subject to his opinion. His reports go to the Board of Guardians. They decide whether you stay, or whether you're discharged into the street again. For some, that day never comes. They die here, their names recorded in a quiet register, buried in unmarked graves with numbers, not stones, forgotten as quickly as they were processed. For others, they leave broken, thin, gaunt, spiritless. The workhouse has stripped them of everything but breath. They carried the memory of it forever. It's discipline, it's shame, it's hunger. They warn others to stay out if they can, but they know not. Everyone can. Because the system is built to be unbearable. It was never meant to help you recover. It was designed to scare you out of needing help in the first place. So as you sit now, at the long wooden table, with gruel cooling in your bowl, and your hands blistered from useless labor, this isn't rescue, it's survival. And it has only just begun. The bell rings before the sun rises. It's not a gentle call, it's a harsh clang. echoing through stone corridors, loud enough to jolt you from even the deepest sleep. You sit up in your bed, barely rested. The thin blanket has done little against the night chill. The air is damp, your breath visible in the morning cold. No time for talking, no time for questions. You dress in silence. The uniform you were issued still itches your skin-coarse wool, poorly fitted. You miss your own clothes, even the ones that were threadbare and patched. At least, they were yours. By 5 a.m., you're standing in the workhouse yard. Men to one side, women to another, children in their own smaller group, blinking sleep from their eyes. Overseers bark out instructions. No one speaks unless spoken to. You don't need reminding. Talking without permission can earn you punishment. Bread and water meals, solitary confinement, or worse. Then, work begins. If you're a man, you're likely assigned to the stone yard or the oakum shed. Stone breaking is just what it sounds like, breaking boulders into smaller chunks with a hammer and wedge. There's no end to the pile. Your hands blister quickly. Your back begins to ache. But you don't stop. You can't. Overseers watch constantly. If they think you're slacking, they shout. If you argue, there are consequences. If you fall ill, you're replaced. The oakum shed is no better. Oakum is old rope, coated in tar. Your job is to pull it apart, strand by strand, ready to be reused for sealing ships. The tar sticks to your fingers. It gets in your nose, under your nails, into your lungs. The smell never leaves. By the end of the shift, your hands are raw, your fingertips cut and blackened. You rub them against your trousers, but the pain stays. If you're a woman, your labor is different, but no easier. Laundry is endless. You scrub sheets in icy water, bring them dry, hang them in damp courtyards. Your knuckles bleed. Your back tightens with each heavy load. Other women are sent to sew uniforms or patch up torn clothing bent over tables, squinting in poor light for hours at a time. The youngest are given chamber pots to empty, corridors to scrub, walls to wipe clean. Children aren't spared. If you're old enough to walk and understand instructions, you're old enough to work. Some are sent to grind corn, sweep floors, or sort rags. Others are loaned out made to apprentice in factories or farms, often without supervision. You might be beaten there, or fall ill. If you're lucky, you make it back to the workhouse in one piece. If not, there's always another child to take your place. Meals are regulated and bland. Breakfast is watery porridge. Lunch might be thin stew with a few turnips or potatoes. Supper, if offered, is a slice of bread and weak tea. There's no choice, no seconds. You eat what you're given or go hungry. Talking during meals is forbidden. You sit in rows, in silence, under the watchful eyes of staff. One wrong word, one spilled cup, and you're reported. There's no privacy, ever. Lavatories are shared, baths are supervised, letters are censored, or outright denied. If you want to see a family member in another ward, you need written permission, and it's rarely granted. You may spend years in the same building as your spouse or child without ever exchanging a word. The day continues until evening, but it feels like it never ends. The hours drag. The work repeats. There's no variation, no weekend, no rest day. Even Sundays, supposedly for worship, are tightly controlled. You attend church services in the workhouse chapel, seated apart from other classes, watched from the pulpit. The sermons often remind you of your failure, of your moral weakness. Poverty, they say, is the result of sin or laziness. You're expected to nod in agreement. Punishment is always close by. If you work too slowly, you're punished. If you speak out of turn, you're punished. If you're seen laughing or resting, even briefly, someone takes your name. The worst offenses, like trying to escape or steal food, can result in solitary confinement in a cold, windowless cell with only bread and water to eat. And yet, despite the brutality, some preferred to the streets. Outside the workhouse is hunger, filth, disease. At least here, you are guaranteed a place to sleep, a piece of bread, a scrap of warmth. That's what keeps most people in. Not comfort, but fear of something worse. You begin to lose track of time. Days blur together. You don't know what season it is anymore. There's no calendar on the wall. No one tells you the news. You live only by the sound of bells. Wake, work, eat, sleep, repeat. Sometimes, you hear rumors that someone escaped, that someone died in the infirmary, that inspectors are coming, that Parliament is talking about reform, but nothing changes. The work continues. The faces around you change. Some die. Some vanish. Some arrive with eyes full of fear the same way you did. After weeks, maybe months, maybe years, the routine becomes part of you. You stop resisting. You don't think of the outside anymore. You don't remember your old address, your full name. You barely even remember what it felt like to laugh freely, to rest, to hope. This isn't rehabilitation. It isn't kindness. The workhouse was designed not to help you rebuild your life, but to make the idea of poverty so unbearable that you'd avoid it at any cost. But for many, there was no choice, no rescue, no end. You lie in bed that night, your arms sore, your hands cracked, your stomach half full. You stare at the ceiling in darkness. You hear the muffled sobs of someone in the next bed. Maybe they're new. Maybe they haven't accepted it yet. You roll onto your side, close your eyes, and wait for the bell. Because tomorrow, it all begins again. You wake before the sun, not because you want to, because the bell demands it. Its sharp clang bounces off the stone walls like a warning. Inmates groan and stir in their cots. There's no time to stretch, no time to collect your thoughts. You're already behind. You throw on your stiff gray uniform, still damp from the night before. If you're lucky, someone hasn't taken your boots. If you're unlucky, you'll be working barefoot. You shuffle into line. No one speaks. You haven't spoken freely in days. A nod here, a whisper there, but nothing more. Talking is discouraged. Laughter is punished. Everything is quiet, not peaceful. You eat a quick breakfast. Thin porridge and a scrap of bread. No butter, no fruit, no second helpings, not even a cup of milk. And when you finish, you scrub your own dish and march to your assigned station. This is the part they never told you. The workhouse is not just a shelter. It's a machine. And you are the fuel. You are not here to be rehabilitated. You are here to be worn down. Men are sent to break stones in the yard. Huge chunks of rock turn to gravel for roads they'll never walk. They swing heavy hammers for hours. Rain or shine, their backs screaming under the strain. Dust chokes the air. Sweat mixes with dirt. The stones are indifferent. So are the overseers. If you're not strong enough for stone breaking, you're picking oakum. Scraps of old ship rope, soaked in tar, ripped apart strand by strand with your fingers until your nails bleed. It's menial, mind-numbing, and painful. You do it sitting silently at long benches. Your hands turn raw within days. Infection is common. So is despair. Women, meanwhile, are often tasked with laundering. Not laundry like you know it. Massive vats of boiling water. Sheets heavier than your body. No gloves, no breaks. The air smelt of bleach and blisters. If you're young or lucky, you'll be assigned to sewing patching uniforms or making garments for institutions. Even then, the light is poor, the needles dull, and the work endless. The elderly might be placed in wards to clean or assist with infirm inmates. That sounds gentle, but it isn't. Bedpans open sores, screaming, death. You become numb. Children aren't spared either. If they're old enough to stand, they're old enough to scrub. Boys are often placed in stone yards or work gangs, under supervision but not protection. Girls may work in the kitchens or laundries with their mothers until they're removed to industrial schools or farmed out as maids or scullery servants. The bell rings at regular intervals to mark time. Start work, pause work, eat, return, stop. It replaces your sense of hours. No clocks are visible in most wards. You learn time through labor. You learn obedience through pain. And the worst part? None of this earns you money. None of this leads to a better job. None of this counts as charity. The work you do is punishment for poverty. The philosophy behind it is cruel but deliberate. If you make the workhouse harsh enough, people will avoid it unless absolutely desperate. This is not a system of support, it's a deterrent, and you're living proof that it works. Supervisors walk the lines of workers, watching constantly. A dropped stone, a ripped seam, a whispered word there, all in fractions. You could lose your food ration, be locked in isolation, be forced to scrub floors on your knees for hours as punishment. No appeal, no explanation, just more silence. The rules, dozens of them, written in cold print, read aloud weekly in the chapel. No idle talk, no insolence, no improper use of bread. Everything has a rule, and every rule has a consequence. By the end of the day, your body aches in places you didn't know could ache. You wash your face with cold water, dry off with a rag, and collapse into your straw mattress. No warmth, just exhaustion. If you dare to whisper to the bunk beside you, The matron may come stomping in. If you twitch in your sleep and kick the frame, someone may curse under their breath, but mostly it's quiet. A hollow, resigned quiet. You don't dream much anymore. Your brain's too tired. Tomorrow, the bell will ring again, and you will do it all over, and the day after that, and the one after, and if you're lucky, someday you will be released. But what kind of person walks back out that gate? Not the one who walked in. The workhouse did not need walls to confine you. Yes, there were gates and locked doors, patrolled yards and curfews, but the most powerful prison was built inside your head. Invisible, but absolute. It began slowly, days blending into each other, rules repeating until they no longer felt like restrictions, but natural laws. The silence was no longer uncomfortable. It was expected. You stopped looking people in the eyes. You stopped asking questions. You started shrinking. They didn't call it brainwashing. Of course, that would have suggested cruelty. They called it discipline. They called it moral reform. But for the people inside, it was more than discipline. It was erasure. You were no longer a worker, a mother, a child with dreams. You became an inmate, a number on a ledger, a body in a system. And the system was designed not just to break your back, but to reshape your spirit. Take the uniforms, for example. Gray, coarse, identical, meant to strip away identity. No flair, just fabric meant to survive endless scrubbing. You couldn't wear jewelry, couldn't keep family trinkets. Even wedding rings were often confiscated on arrival and locked away in ledgers. Then there was language. Inmates weren't called by name, not often. Men were referred to by number or by generic titles. The old man in Block 3, the boy in Ward 5. Women were grouped, those in the laundry, the widow's wing. Children were just the orphans, even when they had living parents inside. Meals were silent. Work was silent. Even chapel wear. You might have expected community was often scripted and one-sided. The sermons reminded you of sin, failure, and repentance. Not grace. Never hope. There was no privacy. None. You slept in long communal halls. You bathed in groups under supervision. Even your correspondence, if permitted, was censored. Letters were opened, packages inspected. Some were never delivered. The outside world faded slowly, like a forgotten dream. For the mentally ill, this isolation was devastating, and many who entered sane did not remain so. Monotony is its own kind of madness. Day after day of repetition, humiliation, and quiet degradation chipped away at resilience. The laughter fades first, then imagination, then hope. You started to feel like you deserved this, and that was the cruelest trick, because once that thought takes root, I am here because I failed, you stop fighting. You eat what you're given, without complaint. You work until your knuckles bleed, without asking why. You accept the punishments, even when unfair. You begin to believe that the outside world has no place for you, that you're safer here, even when safe means slowly decaying in gray silence. Some inmates stayed for years. Some never left. They aged into the institution. The young girl who entered at 12 becomes the matron's silent helper at 20. The man who limped in from the factory becomes a janitor for the ward. Eventually, they weren't even considered inmates anymore, just part of the furniture. Every so often, someone did get out. They earned a small recommendation from the master, got a job cleaning streets or tending stables. But the world outside wasn't welcoming. Employers asked questions. Neighbors whispered, "He came from the workhouse." They'd say, and suddenly, you were an inmate, again outside the gate. Some returned voluntarily. Not because they liked it, because they knew how to survive it. They knew how to follow the rules, how to stay invisible, how to disappear while still breathing. Some inmates created tiny acts of resistance, as stolen crust of bread, a whispered song in the laundry, a small carved figure hidden under the mattress. These weren't crimes, they were survival, because inside the workhouse, rebellion didn't look like riots. It looked like memory. It looked like imagination. It looked like anything that reminded you that you were once someone. A father, a mother, a sister, a boy who liked drawing, a woman who used to laugh at the rain. But even those fragments faded with time. After a while, it didn't take beatings to keep people in line. It just took routine. The same hallway, the same dish, the same cold stare from the master, until you forgot who you were outside the gate. And that was the point. Because to the system, a broken mind is easier to manage than a defiant one. They arrived in silence, sometimes holding a parent's hand, sometimes alone, sometimes not even old enough to speak. Children in the workhouse were not rare. At certain points in the 19th century, They made up nearly half of the total population inside. They weren't hidden, but they weren't seen either. To the system, they weren't kids. They were juveniles, future laborers, and they were treated as such. Upon entry, boys and girls were separated, no matter their age. Brothers and sisters might arrive together and never see each other again. They were sorted by gender and age, then absorbed into the machinery of the institution like bolts into a larger machine. The youngest were placed in nurses, if such a word can be used, rows of wooden cribs, thin mattresses, overworked nurses. Crying was common. Comfort, not so much. Toys were minimal, if allowed at all. Color didn't exist. It was all gray, beige, or washed brown. Children old enough to walk were old enough to work. By age 5 or 6, they swept floors, sorted scraps, folded laundry, or helped in the kitchens. Slight hands were useful in small spaces. They cleaned under beds, carried messages, ran errands across freezing yards with worn shoes. They woke before dawn, lined up for inspections, then marched to school or labor stations depending on the day. The curriculum wasn't about creativity. It was arithmetic, reading, moral lessons, obedience, cleanliness, silence. Punishments were harsh. A boy who spoke out of turn might be kicked. A girl who wet the bed could be made to scrub sheets for a week. Food was withheld for minor offenses. Solitary confinement existed even for children. But perhaps the cruelest punishment was indifference. There was no affection, no bedtime stories, no birthday celebration, no hugs, just regulations. The staff, many of them hardened by years inside, referred to children not by name, but by numbers or uniforms. Boy 27, to the laundry. Girl 14, stand straight. There was no time for softness, no allowance for love. And yet, somehow, childhood still tried to bloom. Some children whispered jokes while folding linen. Others carved initials into the wooden bedposts. A piece of string could become a toy. A dropped button might be traded like treasure. And stories half-remembered fairy tales and legends were passed down from child to child like sacred truths. These moments weren't sanctioned. They were survival. Children played in secret, spoke in hushed tones, invented games out of boredom and desperation. They created imaginary worlds where they were pirates or queens, far from the ever-watchful eyes of the matron. But the older they got, the more that play disappeared. By the time they were 12, many were apprenticed out or hired by local farms, factories, or households. Some became chimney sweeps. Some were sent to coal pits. Others to textile mills where looms never stopped and fingers were often lost. They left the workhouse with calluses, not dreams. Some returned, broken or injured, and were readmitted as adults already institutionalized before adulthood began. Others vanished into poverty, repeating the cycle of hardship that had brought them here in the first place. And some, didn't survive at all. Records tell us that infant mortality inside workhouses was tragically high. Malnutrition, disease, neglect. Children who entered sick sometimes never recovered. Others grew sick from overcrowding, poor ventilation, or contaminated water. The lucky ones found placement with kind family, or escaped through education, rare as that was. A few rose up and spoke out later in life, became writers, activists. But for most, the memory of the workhouse never left. Even decades later, they remembered the cold floors, the hard bread, the sound of boots on stone during roll call, the fear of the matron's keys rattling, the constant hunger not just for food, but for attention, for someone to say, "You matter." They remembered watching the gate, hoping to see a familiar face. They remembered pretending not to cry. They remembered the absence of toys, of warmth, of softness. And they remembered growing up too fast. Much too fast. Because inside the workhouse, you weren't raised, you were processed. So when we talk about the poor of Victorian England, don't just picture the bent-backed adults. Picture the children too, standing in oversized uniforms, holding cracked bowls, eyes wide, not with wonder but with hunger and confusion. They weren't just victims of poverty. They were survivors of a system that forgot they were children. In a place built on silence, regulation, and control, the most radical thing anyone could do was fall in love. The Victorian workhouse was not a place for sentiment. It was not built to nurture connection, only to enforce order. Men, women, and children were segregated, housed in different wings, kept apart in dining halls, separated in labor. Even married couples who entered together were divided, often not seeing each other for weeks, months, or even years. So how could Lev survive? The answer: quietly, carefully, and often dangerously. Any display of affection, so much as a note passed or a smile held too long, was seen as an infraction. Romantic attachments were a threat to the entire philosophy of the workhouse: discipline, morality, and a deep suspicion of desire. And yet, relationships still bloomed, because no system can fully extinguish the human need to connect. Some began innocently enough, fleeting glances during chapel, exchanged words during supervised tasks. If two inmates worked in the laundry or garden at the same time, they might whisper beneath the noise. The workhouse tried to control where your hands went, but not where your heart wandered. Others found ways to communicate through codes: a folded handkerchief, a scratched message in a wall, shared smuggled crumbs during supper. Small rebellions of kindness, risky but human. Some of these connections turned into real relationships. Sometimes secret rendezvous were arranged in neglected corridors, behind outbuildings, or under stairwells. Intimacy was rare, risky, and harshly punished if discovered. Pregnancy, especially, was a scandal. An unmarried woman found to be pregnant was labeled immoral, disgraced, and in many cases, transferred to the lying-in ward. Her child would be born inside the same walls of shame. The man involved, if known, might be punished too, but often, the burden fell entirely on the woman. Infant mortality in workhouses was high, and emotional support was non-existent. A mother might deliver a child and lose it the same week. She'd grieve silently, perhaps while still forced to scrub floors with raw hands and leaking milk. There were no grief counselors. No one asked how she felt. But sometimes, love led to escape. There are recorded cases of couples who plotted their way out. They coordinated discharge dates, or married quickly upon release. Some wrote letters in secret and reunited on the outside. It didn't always last, but for a brief time, they had carved something real from the stone and cold. And sometimes, affection wasn't romantic. It was sibling bonds, mother-daughter care, or quiet friendships that looked out for one another. A boy might take the blame for a stolen apple to protect a friend. These were acts of love, too, and they were just as forbidden. Matron and master kept eyes on everything. Relationships, even platonic ones, were seen as breeding grounds for insubordination. Attachments created loyalties. Loyalties created resistance. Resistance threatened order. So they cracked down. Transfers, separations, isolation. Staff were instructed to remain emotionally distant. But even among them, stories emerged of kindness. A sympathetic nurse might shield a young couple. A porter might accidentally leave a door unlatched. Rules were rules. Yes, but some hearts bent, anyway. There were also darker relationships, coercive, exploitative ones. Some inmates, particularly young women, were vulnerable to abuse by staff. In those cases, the line between punishment and manipulation blurred. Complaints were rarely believed. Victims were often blamed, and the shame stayed with them forever. But even here, survivors found ways to resist. They formed whisper networks, shared warnings, hid each other, raised small alarms when they could. It was dangerous, yes, but in a place built on silence, every whisper of resistance mattered. The real tragedy is not that love existed in the workhouse, it's that it had to be hidden. In a just world, these connections between lovers, siblings, friends would be celebrated. But in the workhouse, they were policed, suppressed, punished, because affection is powerful, and power was what the system feared most. Still, the human heart finds a way. Today, we can read letters that were smuggled out, memoirs of former inmates who recalled the warmth of another's hand in a sea of cold indifference. Even official punishment records sometimes hint at what really happened. Inmate No. 200. Found in unauthorized corridor at 8:15 p.m. A dry note for a night of longing. The walls were gray. The rules were rigid. But love, in all its forms, slipped through the cracks like sunlight under a door. So if you imagine the workhouse as rows of cots and harsh discipline, you're not wrong. But listen closer, and you might hear the hidden story. A whispered name. A stifled laugh. A hand held too long. Not just survival, but connection. Not just suffering, but quiet rebellion. Because even in the darkest places, people find each other. In the Victorian workhouse, death was not a release. It was merely the next line in the ledger. There was no funeral procession through cobbled streets. No mourners dressed in black. No family huddled around a polished casket. If you died in the workhouse, the end came quietly and often anonymously. Most inmates were elderly, infirm, or chronically ill. The workhouse infirmary, overcrowded and underfunded, became their final destination. Beds lined the walls, crammed together with barely enough space to walk between. The smell was thick disinfectant, urine, unwashed bodies, and decay. Nurses, overworked and often untrained, did what they could. Some were kind, others were indifferent or harsh. Pain relief was minimal. Morphine was a luxury. Patients died slowly, their final days marked by silence, coughs, and whispered prayers. There was no priest by every bedside, no lash rites, unless specifically requested, and, even then, only if someone had time. The dying were treated as one more task on a long list. No tears, no comfort, just the slow dimming of breath. When death finally came, the body was removed promptly. There were no grand rituals, just a stretcher, a blanket, and a trip to the workhouse mortuary. In most workhouses, the dead were kept in a small, cold-out building, the dead house. There, they waited. For what? For identification? Perhaps for a coroner's report, for a pauper's coffin. The family, if they had one and were notified, might be allowed to claim the body. But often, there was no one, or no one willing to pay. Funerals cost money, even the simplest kind, and so many remained unclaimed bodies. No headstones, no names, just rows of numbers and forgotten bones. The pauper's graveyard was often a separate area, far from the town cemetery. Some workhouses had their own burial grounds, hidden behind hedges or walls. Others contracted local parishes for cheap. The bodies were stacked coffins layered 3, 4, even 5 deep. Soil, wood, bone, repeat. Coffins were plain and thin, just enough wood to cover the body. No brass handles, just pine, quickly nailed shut. If a funeral was held, it was brief. Perhaps a clergyman mumbled a few words. Perhaps a hymn was sung, half-heartedly. But there were no mourners, unless fellow inmates were assigned to attend. Most were buried alone. And yet, even death had a darker layer. Because workhouse bodies had value, medical schools were desperate for cadavers, and the law allowed the unclaimed dead to be given to science. Technically, permission was needed, but poor people had little say. Many families, upon visiting days later, were horrified to discover the body already dissected. It was efficient, and it was horrifying. Some resisted. They refused workhouse aid precisely to avoid dying there, because death in the workhouse meant indignity, anonymity, possibly dissection, possibly mass burial with no trace. And so, charities stepped in. Religious groups and benevolent societies tried to provide decent burials. They raised funds, paid for simple plots, placed small markers. It was a drop in the ocean, but for some, it meant everything. Inmates, too, found ways to honor the dead. Quietly, a whispered prayer, a shared memory, a piece of bread left beside an empty cot, tiny rituals in a place that offered none. Over time, communities began to push back. They demanded better. Cemeteries added sections for headstones were erected. Public concern over anatomy theft led to tighter laws, but change was slow. Too slow for thousands already lost. And even now, their names are mostly gone. Grave records from workhouses were poorly kept or later destroyed. Many burial grounds were built, overturned into parks, car parks, or housing estates. But occasionally, someone finds something. A bone unearthed during construction. A faded ledger in a county archive. A name, Mary T. Died of fever, age 46. Unclaimed. A life reduced to a line. Yet, even those lines matter. Historians now comb through them, piecing together who these people were. Ordinary lives. Lost ones. Their stories, once erased, slowly returning to light. So what did it mean to die in a workhouse? It meant to die poor, quietly, often alone. It meant no comfort, no ceremony, no legacy. Unless someone remembered you. Unless someone like you. Now, reading this pause to wonder who lay in the unmarked soil, who they were, what they dreamed, even as their world narrowed to a cold bed and an indifferent nurse. They were people, just like us, and they deserved better. So the next time you pass a silent patch of grass in an old English town, consider, beneath your feet may lie 100 forgotten lives, stacked together. No stones, no names, but not truly gone, because now, you know, a child's cry echoed down the stone corridors of the Victorian Workhouse, not a tantrum, but a hollow, tired sound. Hunger, cold, loneliness, If you were a child born into poverty in the 19th century, the workhouse may have been your only home. Some were orphans, some were abandoned. Others arrived with their parents, forced to choose between starvation outside and shame inside. The workhouse promised food and shelter, but at a devastating price. Children were separated from their families almost immediately, siblings torn apart, infants removed from mothers, sometimes within hours of arrival. This wasn't accidental, it was policy. The system believed that discipline and separation would prevent the poor from growing too attached to each other, or too comfortable with aid. Boys went one way, girls another. Infants to the nursery, older children to the schoolroom or the labor yard. Many never saw their parents again. Workhouse schools were not gentle places. Education was there were few books, fewer qualified teachers, and no play. Laughter was considered undisciplined. The goal was not to nurture minds, but to mold obedient laborers. And labor began early. Boys as young as 7 were sent to help in the workhouse yard, crushing bones for fertilizer or carrying water. Girls scrubbed floors, laundered linen, or assisted in the kitchens. The smallest children ran errands or tended infants. There were no toys, no games, no time to dream. Meals were meat, gruel for breakfast, bread and weak broth for lunch, a bit of boiled meat, if lucky, once a week. Hunger was a constant shadow. Many children grew stunted, both physically and emotionally. Their growth was monitored, but mostly for administrative records, not out of concern. The clothing was uniform, shapeless smocks, coarse fabric, shoes if available. Identity disappeared under layers of regulation. Even names were sometimes shortened or replaced with numbers. Punishment was swift and strict. Talking out of turn, standing in a corner, stealing food, caning, trying to visit a sibling in the wrong wing, solitary confinement or worse. Compassion from staff varied. Some matronly figures tried to protect the children. Others were cruel, bored, or simply overworked. For many, the worst part wasn't the labor or the hunger. It was the loneliness. Imagine being 8 years old, sleeping in a room of 50 other children, none of whom you know, waking in the dark to the sound of coughing, crying, or silence, knowing your mother is just 2 wings away but unreachable. It was institutionalized isolation, engineered to suppress rebellion and emotion. Outside the workhouse, society often blamed these children for their poverty. They were seen as pauper stock, likely to grow into criminals or degenerates. Few had advocates. Even fewer had second chances. And yet, despite it all, some children survived. Some even escaped. At around age 12 or 14, many were apprenticed out, sent to work for farmers, blacksmiths, or domestic employers. In theory, this was a fresh start. In practice, many were sent to grueling labor with little oversight. Girls were especially vulnerable to exploitation. Boys often ended up in dangerous trades with no training. Some ran away. Some returned to the workhouse, injured or starved. Others vanished into factories, onto streets, or into early graves. But a few made lives for themselves, joined the army, married, started families, and never spoke of the workhouse again. Records show rare successes. A girl who became a schoolteacher, a boy who opened a small shop. But for every one of them, a dozen more faded into history, unnamed and unremembered. Later reforms brought minor improvements. Inspectors demanded better schooling. Charitable organizations intervened, offering toys, outings, or more humane clothing. But the damage had long been done. The workhouse generation carried their scars silently, far into adulthood. In some towns, remnants of workhouse schools still stand. Faded chalkboards, rusted bed frames, a cracked slate with a child's name etched faintly into the corner. It's not just archaeology, it's memory, and it speaks volumes. Because these weren't just statistics, they were children. They had names, they had fears, they had moments of wonder, even within stone walls. Maybe one watched a bird flutter past a barred window. Maybe one whispered stories to a friend in the dark. Maybe one dreamed of a different life, one with color and warmth and freedom. They rarely got it, but they mattered, and they deserve more than to be forgotten behind the cold facade of brick and iron. She was the first voice you heard when you entered the workhouse. The click of her shoes echoed down stone corridors. The iron ring of keys at her waist clinked softly with each step, and behind her, ice calculation, wariness, and just maybe, a flicker of sympathy. She was the matron, and within the grim architecture of the Victorian Workhouse, her role was pivotal. To some inmates, she was a tyrant. To others, a reluctant guardian. To everyone, she was unavoidable, a woman in control. But at what cost? The matron held enormous responsibility within the workhouse walls. She oversaw the women's and children's wards, sometimes hundreds of individuals. She managed births, supervised deaths, allocated chores, and enforced discipline. She was cook, nurse, teacher, and warden rolled into one. And yet, her power was never absolute. She answered to the master, her male counterpart, who oversaw the entire workhouse, and ultimately to the Board of Guardians, a group of local men who dictated policy and budgets. She had to justify expenses, obey regulations, and maintain strict order, or risk being dismissed herself. Most matrons were widows or unmarried women with few options. The salary was modest, but it came with room and board. 4 women in Victorian England excluded from most professions and expected to be a matron offered rare financial independence, but it came at a price. The matron lived in the same building as the inmates. She was never truly off duty. If a child died in the night, she was summoned. If a girl gave birth unexpectedly, she had to manage it. If a fight broke out among the laundresses, it was her problem. There was no retreat, no peace. Ruled by routine, her day began before dawn. Rations, roll calls, sanitation inspections. She reviewed work assignments, scrubbing, washing, peeling potatoes, cleaning latrines. She dispensed linen, oversaw the distribution of food, and kept endless records. How many loaves of bread? How many bars of soap? How many sick? She had to enforce silence during meals, discipline during labor, separation of sexes, cleanliness at all times. Every aspect of inmate life was her concern, from lice infestations to childbirth complications. And yet, despite the rigidity, much depended on her personality. Some matrons were notoriously cruel. Letters from former inmates described women who starved the sick, beat orphans, or humiliated pregnant girls. These matrons viewed compassion as weakness. They were products of a system that equated poverty with moral failure. Others were fair, stern, yes, but not malicious. They smuggled extra rations to underfed children. They allowed a grieving mother an extra moment with her dying infant. They bent rules quietly, in places the guardians wouldn't notice. But even the kindest matron could not escape the system's weight. Mother of none, caretaker of hundreds. The paradox was crushing. The matron was tasked with nurturing women and children, but forbidden from forming true connections. She was instructed to remain emotionally distant, to uphold regulations that tore families apart. She saw girls arrive pregnant, ashamed, and alone. She managed their confinement workhouses, were often the only places poor women could give birth. She swaddled their babies. She watched them cry as those babies were taken away, sometimes to the nursery, sometimes to baby farms, sometimes to graves. The matron recorded each death in careful script. Infant 3 days old, cause diarrhea, and she moved on, because she had to. Her survival, too, depended on control. To the children, she could be terrifying. Her stiff apron, her tight bun, her sharp voice, they symbolized authority in a world already starved of affection. But sometimes, a child would remember something different. A warm cloth placed on a fevered brow, a hand steadying trembling fingers. A lullaby hummed beneath the clatter of the laundry room. Unofficial kindness in a place that discouraged it. The public eye. Matrons were often judged harshly by the outside world. Newspapers occasionally published horror stories from disgruntled inmates. Parliamentary inspectors sometimes uncovered shocking conditions: undernourished children, filthy wards, abusive treatment. But often, these scandals faded quickly. Guardians defended their staff. Matrons were blamed or exonerated depending on politics and public mood. The workhouse kept running. Some matrons left memoirs. Most did not. Their lives were recorded in ledgers, not letters. They rarely married. They aged quickly. Their roles consumed them, and when they retired or were dismissed, they were replaced without ceremony. Another woman, another set of keys, memory, and judgment. Today, it's tempting to cast the matron as villain or victim. Was she a cog in a brutal machine, or its enforcer? The truth is, messier, she was both. She upheld rules that harmed people. She lived under those same rules. She could be harsh out of necessity. She could be kind at great personal risk. She was not free, but she had choices. And within those narrow margins, she shaped the lives of hundreds. Some inmates left the workhouse remembering her as a symbol of cruelty. Others, as the only adult who ever noticed them. Her face rarely appears in photographs. Her name, sometimes found at the bottom of a workhouse report, is easily overlooked. But without her, the workhouse could not function. And perhaps that's what makes her story so haunting. She kept the machine running because someone had to. Death in the workhouse came quietly. Not with screams or ceremony, but with a cough that didn't stop. A bowl of broth left untouched. A chill that settled into the bones and never quite left. In the long wards of the infirmary, where the sick and elderly lay beneath thin blankets, the end often arrived with little more than a sigh. Many of the people who died in the workhouse were not criminals or idlers, as Victorian myths would suggest. They were workers, widows, children, and elderly men who had run out of options. By the late 1800s, workhouses had effectively become the last refuge for the poor and old. The institution that had been designed as a deterrent to laziness became, in practice, the final address for thousands. Each morning began with roll call, and when someone did not answer, the attendants would know. Perhaps they had passed in the night, unnoticed by their neighbors in the dim light. A porter would be summoned, the ledger updated, and just like that, one life ended, and the next meal was prepared as usual. Life, in its mechanical rhythm, continued. The dead were removed from the ward and taken to a separate building, often a cold stone mortuary known simply as the dead house. There, the body would wait, sometimes for a day, sometimes for longer. There were few mourners, few questions. Most died alone. Most were never claimed. Families were often unable or unwilling to pay for burial. In that case, the body was sent to a common grave and marked unremembered. The cemetery grounds were used and reused, with layers of the poor buried atop one another, their identities lost beneath the soil. And yet, records remained. Names, ages, occupations, even the cause of death, noted by hand in ledgers still kept in archives today. These quiet traces are often all that remain. There were other fates, too. Under the Anatomy Act of 1832, unclaimed bodies could legally be sent for medical dissection if no family stepped forward and no burial was arranged within 48 hours. The law allowed the remains to be given to hospitals or universities. The poor had little say in death, just as they had little choice in life. The idea of being dissected after death horrified many workhouse inmates. Some refused to die indoors, preferring to take their chances on the streets. Others begged surviving relatives to claim their body at any cost. And some went quietly, without resistance, perhaps too tired to fight the final indignity. Despite this grim system, there were moments of quiet dignity. Some nurses and attendants, moved by compassion, made efforts to soften the end. A clean sheet, a cup of water, a silent prayer. In certain workhouses, staff would allow flowers or a short hymn, even if the body was destined for a pauper's grave. These gestures weren't part of the rules, but they mattered nonetheless. For other inmates, death brought a strange kind of relief. No more gruel, no more stone floors or cold mornings, no more inspections or endless, enforced silence. In some ways, the workhouse was a place where people were allowed to vanish, quietly and completely. But the fear of dying in such a place remained powerful. It shaped entire generations' views of poverty and the poor. To end one's life in a workhouse was seen as shameful not because of the person, but because of what it said about the world around them, about a society that had let them fall so far. Today, many of those old workhouses are gone, their stones reused, their land built over. But some remnants remain. A rusted gate, a corner of a hospital wing, a name carved into a wall. Beneath modern cities, paupers' graves still lie in silence. Parks, train stations, housing developments all built over the forgotten dead. Yet these people lived full lives before their final days. They had names, faces, stories, and they remind us of something very old and very simple, that dignity is not a luxury, it's a need, in life and especially in death. What does a society owe to those who have nothing left? Not just shelter or food, but humanity. This question echoes, still, in the empty corridors of buildings long since abandoned, where the poor once waited for their last breath unseen, unheard, and too often, unloved. To be a child in a Victorian workhouse was not to play, or dream, or be gently taught. It was to be managed, controlled, molded. The workhouse school was not a place of curiosity. Each morning began with a bell, loud, sharp. Children were marched from the dormitories in straight lines, silent, eyes forward. No speaking in the corridors. No, boys went one way, girls another. At the door of the schoolroom, they waited for a signal. Only then could they enter. Inside, The classroom was bare. Wooden benches, small slates, and chalk. A single blackboard at the front. No books, except for the Bible. The walls were blank. No artwork. No maps. No color. Learning here was about obedience, not imagination. The master or mistress stood at the front, often undertrained, sometimes harsh. Their main task was control, not inspiration. Children sat for hours, memorizing prayers, reciting the alphabet, copying sums. If they erred, they were corrected swiftly, sometimes with a sharp word, sometimes with a cane. Subjects were basic: reading, writing, arithmetic. Religious instruction was constant. Morality was stressed above all. Poor children, it was believed, needed strong moral guidance lest they grow into criminals or worse. So, they were taught to be quiet, to be grateful, to know their place. But even in this bleak setting, there were differences. Some schools had a kind teacher, someone who saw the children as more than mouths to feed or heads to count. Others were brutal. Inspectors' reports from the 19th century described children whipped for whispering or locked alone in cold rooms. Even illness didn't excuse them from lessons. Many were made to sit at their desks, coughing, pale, too weak to concentrate. Food was meager, usually just bread and broth, sometimes a bit of porridge in the morning. Lunchtime was brief, then back to the classroom. Breaks were short. Play was discouraged. Toys were virtually... But play happened anyway, in small moments. A shared smile, a pebble tossed and caught, a chalk drawing scrawled in secret on the underside of a bench. Children made do. They always do. By the age of 9 or 10, many children were moved to labor. Boys might be sent to learn trades: shoemaking. Girls were taught domestic skills, laundry, needlework, kitchen labor. The goal was to turn them into useful workers, fit for service or the factory floor. For orphans and foundlings, the workhouse school was often the only education they would ever receive. Their names were recorded in long ledgers, but their lives slipped by quietly. Many were sent out as apprentices, some to kind employers, others to cruel masters who saw them as nothing more than cheap labor. And yet, here and there, a child escaped the system. One might show promise in reading or writing and be sent to a charity school. Another might be taken in by a distant relative. But for the vast majority, the workhouse school was their entire world. Gray, confined, and their drawings were erased. Their dreams rarely asked about, but they were children nonetheless, laughing when they could, crying in the dark, holding tight to a sibling's hand during inspections or prayers. Today, we might walk past the site of one of these schools and never know what took place there. The buildings have changed, the walls repainted, but the echoes remain, faint but real. The sound of chalk on slate, the crack of a ruler, the whisper of a child saying the alphabet, hoping they'll get it right. In a world built to forget the poor, the workhouse child was taught to stay silent, but their silence speaks volumes, even now. Imagine living in a place where the rules followed you everywhere, where one wrong word, one glance, one whisper could earn you not a warning but punishment. In the Victorian workhouse, discipline wasn't just expected, it was enforced with quiet cruelty. Silence was the first rule. Talking was forbidden during meals, in dormitories, even in the long corridors where footsteps echoed like guilt. Children caught speaking out of turn were marked. Adults could be reprimanded, demoted to worse jobs, or worse. Solitary confinement was common. For hours, sometimes days, inmates were locked in small stone cells, sometimes without light or bedding, bread and water. If that, the only sound, the click of the door behind them, and the ticking of a slow, patient clock. There was the Kranken, infamous device used in many workhouses. It looked harmless enough. A drum with a handle. The inmate had to turn it, again and again, thousands of times. It served no purpose but punishment. Resistance was met with longer shifts. Complaints were ignored. Sometimes, weights were added to increased resistance. It was, quite literally, a machine of pointless labor. Another favored method was the shot drill. Prisoners moved heavy cannonballs from one side of a yard to the other and then back again. There was no goal, no product, no utility, just the draining of time and strength, a test of obedience and submission. Children, too, were punished, not often with the crank or the shot drill, but with isolation, deprivation, or public shaming. A girl might be made to wear a placard reading "thief" if caught taking extra bread. A boy might be whipped with a birch rod for swearing. Even the sick weren't always spared. The belief was that punishment built character, that pain corrected flaws, that suffering produced obedience. Refusing work, that meant fewer rations. The master had wide discretion. For repeat offenses, there were legal consequences. Inmates could be tried by magistrates and sentenced to prison for disobedience within the workhouse walls. And yet, some punishments were being moved to a worse job, separated from family members, made to clean privies or work alone in the yard. Some were made to sleep without blankets. Others had their meager possessions confiscated. There were rules for everything: what to wear, when to speak, how to walk, even how to sit. Inspectors wrote about slovenly behavior and bad attitude as if poverty itself was a moral crime. The system didn't just punish actions, it punished people for being poor, uneducated, different, or just unlucky. Even kindness was controlled. Staff were warned not to get too close to inmates. To maintain order, emotional distance was required. A sympathetic matron might be replaced, a kind master seen as weak. The institution was designed to be feared, not loved. But there were cracks. Occasionally, a whistleblower would write a letter. A journalist would publish a scandal. In some cases, punishments were reined in, conditions slightly improved, but the structure remained. Control through fear, correction through pain. And outside, society looked on with approval. The poor needed discipline, they said. Otherwise, they'd grow idle. The workhouse was meant to deter, to humiliate, to reform. Yet inside those high brick walls, the people punished were rarely wicked. They were widows, children, the sick, the old, people caught in bad luck, bad harvests, bad marriages. And still, the rules came down hard, equal in their cruelty, unequal in their effect. Now picture the crank again, turning endlessly in a damp room. A man sweating, teeth clenched. Not a criminal, just a former cobbler who spoke out of turn. He turns the crank not for redemption, but because he has no choice. The workhouse punished not just for wrongdoing, but for existing within its walls. Despite the rigid discipline, harsh punishments, and constant surveillance, Victorian workhouses were not immune to defiance. Though built to break the spirit, they also, at times, sparked it. Inmates rebelled. They ran. They resisted. And occasionally, they made the walls tremble not with violence, but with desperate acts of humanity. Escape was rare, but not unheard of. Workhouses were not prisons. Technically, inmates could leave, but only if they were willing to face destitution, starvation, or arrest for Still, for many, the idea of freedom, even hungry freedom, was worth the risk. Some walked out and never returned, vanishing into the fog of London's alleys or the open roads of the countryside. Others were caught, quickly hauled back by constables or guardians, punished and shamed before the rest. A few tried multiple times, often with tragic results. Elderly women wandering miles in the cold. Young boys hiding in haystacks or stowing away in carts. More dramatic were the riots and collective rebellions. These were not common, but when they happened, they made headlines. In 1846, at the end of her workhouse, inmates rioted over the discovery that they were being forced to gnaw on bones, meant for fertilizer scraps so devoid of meat, they were nearly dust. The scandal shook the nation. Investigations followed. A master was dismissed, but the system endured. In other places, protests took quieter forms. Hunger strikes, mass refusals to work, singing or praying aloud when silence was demanded, mothers demanding to see their children, elderly men refusing to scrub latrines. Resistance didn't always look like mutiny, it often looked like insistence on being seen. Sometimes, it came in the form of letters smuggled out, dictated to sympathetic clerks, or written in careful scrawl, complaints of mistreatment, of cold food, of missing blankets, of brutality. Some reached newspapers or parliament, others were buried in dusty records, ignored or forgotten. And then there were the courtroom dramas, inmates who dared to speak out, publicly to accuse masters and matrons of cruelty, theft, or worse. Their testimonies were often dismissed, their characters attacked, but occasionally, they won. They exposed corruption, they forced reform. Even a single voice, trembling and poor, could shift the tide if it found an audience willing to listen. Children were often the most daring, sneaking between wards, trading scraps, passing notes. Some ran, small legs carrying them over high walls or under iron gates. They were usually brought back, but for a moment, they tasted freedom. And for some, it lit a fire that never went out. There were even rumors never proven of staff who aided escapes. A compassionate nurse turning a blind eye, a clerk leaving a door unlocked. Tiny acts of rebellion within a machine of order. But rebellion had its costs. Most ended in punishment. Loss of rations, solitary confinement, public shaming, and always the looming threat of prison outside the workhouse walls. The law was not on the poor's side, nor was society, most of the time. Still, they resisted, because resistance, however small, was a reminder of agency. A mother smuggling extra bread to her son, an old man refusing the crank, a teenager slipping over a fence in the early dawn. They resisted because the workhouse took everything else. Their names, their trades, their families, but not always their will. And though these acts rarely brought revolution, they carved cracks in the edifice of the system, cracks that widened year by year until eventually the workhouse model began to fall. It would take decades, reformers, and shifting tides of public opinion. But those first ripples came not from parliament or policy but from within the workhouse walls, from those who, in the face of hunger and hardship, still found the strength to say no more. For much of the 19th century, the inner workings of workhouses remained cloaked in silence, sealed behind thick stone walls and guarded by bureaucracy. But eventually, eyes began to peer inside. Some belonged to reformers, others to journalists, a few, to the very officials tasked with oversight. And what they saw was not easily forgotten. At the heart of this awakening was the Poor Law Board, established to oversee workhouses across Britain. Theoretically, they dispatched inspectors to ensure humane conditions. In practice, visits were infrequent, and many abuses went unnoticed. The problem wasn't lack of rules, but lack of accountability. That began to change in the 1830s and 1840s, when a handful of determined inspectors started to write what they saw with unsettling clarity. They described children without shoes in winter, inmates denied proper medical care, food riddled with insects, punishments that bordered on cruelty. Their reports were filed, often quietly, but some began to leak. The most notorious came from the Andover workhouse scandal in 1846, when it was revealed that starving inmates were fighting over rotting bones meant not for soup, but for grinding into fertilizer. The official tasked with investigating, Henry Parker, found evidence of theft, abuse, and neglect. His report shocked Parliament and forced a reckoning. For a time, but it wasn't just inspectors. Reformers began visiting workhouses. People like Charles Dickens, who used his pen as a spotlight. His visit to the Field Lane Ragged School in the 1840s inspired Oliver Twist, with its infamous scenes of gruel and cruelty. Though fictional, Dickens' depictions were rooted in bitter truth. They stirred public outrage and sympathy. Newspapers took up the cause. In the latter half of the century, the Times, Punch, and regional papers began to print anonymous letters, whistleblower accounts, and first-hand descriptions of what life was really like behind the gates. Suddenly, the workhouse was not just a theory of poor relief, it was a real place, with real suffering, and readers couldn't look away. Even medical journals joined in. The Lancet sent physicians to inspect workhouse infirmaries. What they found was alarming. Untrained staff, reused surgical tools, contagious diseases left unchecked. In some places, the elderly and dying were housed in freezing wards, lying in soiled bedding, unattended. The journal's reports were damning and undeniable. These led to waves of reform efforts. New regulations were drafted. Some masters were replaced. Infirmaries were upgraded in wealthier parishes. But as always, reforms moved slowly and unevenly. Rural workhouses remained neglected. Corrupt guardians found ways around scrutiny. And still, the system endured. Still, the power of being seen mattered. When officials knew someone might ask questions, they hesitated. When newspapers printed real names and real places, shame did what policy often couldn't. And when the public began to associate workhouses not with laziness, but with suffering, the moral calculus began to shift. Some inspectors became unlikely champions for the poor. They pushed for separate wards for children. They lobbied for improved food. They argued for female nurses instead of drunk male attendants. Not because they were radicals, but because they could no longer pretend. Meanwhile, reformers like Florence Nightingale and Joseph Rowntree gathered data, built statistics, and used evidence to demand change. They turned individual tragedies into policy arguments. They reminded Britain that poverty was not a crime and that punishment would not cure it. By the 1880s, Public opinion was changing. Workhouses were still full, but they were no longer invisible. Inspectors were still flawed, but they were no longer blind. And the press, once silent, had become a relentless force. The system didn't collapse overnight, but it cracked. And every report, every article, every hidden truth brought it closer to its end. So when you think of the Victorian workhouse, don't just picture the suffering. Picture the voices that broke through the silence. The pens that carved through apathy. The eyes that saw and told the world. Because change, in the end, didn't come from pity. It came from exposure. By the early 20th century, the walls of the Victorian workhouse were crumbling not all at once, but piece by piece. Public sentiment had turned. The scandals had done their work, and so had the slow grind of reform. In 1930, under the Local Government Act, the workhouse system was officially dismantled, but buildings remained. So did memories, and so, too, did the legacy etch deep into British consciousness. For decades, many former workhouses were simply renamed public assistance institutions, welfare homes. Some were converted into hospitals or housing for the elderly. Others were left abandoned. Their bricks, once symbols of suffering, now sat quiet under ivy and rain. But the architecture didn't forget, nor did the people who had passed through their gates. The trauma endured, especially for those who entered as children. Some never spoke of their time inside. Others recounted tales of hunger, humiliation, and the aching loneliness of being separated from family. In small towns across Britain, former inmates lived among neighbors who either pitied or judged them. The workhouse left social scars that lingered for generations. Even language held on to the shame. Going to the workhouse remained a fearful phrase. Long after the system ended, elderly people would speak of it as the ultimate disgrace. Parents warned children to behave, or you'll end up in the workhouse. It became less a place, more a threat, a symbol of failure in a society obsessed with suffering. And yet, some former workhouses transformed into places of care. In the newly established National Health Service after many infirmaries once attached to workhouses became hospitals. The very wards where paupers had once died without dignity now saw the birth of new lives, tended by nurses trained not in cruelty, but compassion. It was a strange, circular fate. Historians began to re-examine the system. What had it accomplished? What had it destroyed? Debates still rage. Some argue it kept millions from starvation. Others see it as a deeply flawed model that criminalized poverty and institutionalized cruelty. Both may be true. In modern Britain, you can still find some old workhouses have been converted into apartments. Others sit as museums. A few, like the workhouse inside, have been preserved to show exactly what life was like. Inside the cold stone, the tiny rooms, the silence. Visitors today walk through those spaces with unease, not because of ghosts, but because of the questions that linger. How did a civilized nation allow such suffering? Why did it take so long to change? And what have we truly learned? Because the shadows of the workhouse still stretch into today, in debates about welfare, in attitudes toward the poor, in the bureaucracy of modern institutions. The same tension exists. Are we helping people or judging them? Supporting them or punishing them? And there are echoes. In food banks that replace soup lines, in housing benefits that come with layers of stigma, in the moral suspicion still attached to poverty. So the story of the Victorian workhouse isn't just history, it's a mirror, a reminder of how society treats its most vulnerable, of what happens when systems forget the human beings within them. The buildings may be gone, but the questions remain, and they demand answers not from the past, but from the present.